3 weeks after I buried my only daughter, a package appeared at my door with 5 words on the label: for Dad. Don't open yet. Inside was her mother's old wristwatch, the hands frozen at 6. Beneath it, a folded note in my daughter's handwriting. The man sleeping under your roof is not who you think he is. Neither is the woman beside you. I looked up from the letter. My son-in-law was standing in the doorway smiling at me, and the color drained from my face. Welcome to Revenge. Dad, our family channel. I'm deeply thankful for your presence. To help me find our community, please comment with your city or country right now. Please note, certain fictionalized elements have been added to this story for engagement. Any similarities to actual profiles are coincidental, but the lessons remain essential. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks to the day after I buried my daughter. I was sitting at the kitchen table when I heard the mail slot open, that familiar creak I had been meaning to oil for 6 years and never did. A small brown paper parcel dropped onto the hallway floor with a soft thud. I didn't move right away. Since Julie's funeral, I had developed the habit of sitting very still in the mornings, the way a man sits when he is afraid that moving too fast might shake loose something that is barely holding together inside him. Clara appeared in this kitchen doorway before I could push back my chair. "I'll get it," she said, already moving down the hallway. In her house slippers, her gray cardigan pulled tight across her chest. She was like that, always there before you needed her, always just a step ahead. 14 months of marriage, and I still wasn't used to it. Eleanor, God rest her, had believed that a man should be allowed to answer his own front door. Clara came back, holding the parcel with both hands. She set it on the table in front of me and tilted her head the way she did when she was watching for something. "No return address," she said. "The handwriting looks like—" She stopped. "Like Julie's," I said. Clara pressed her lips together and put her hand on my shoulder. "Oh, Arthur, do you want me to open it?" "No," I said. "Thank you, Clara. I'll do it myself." She stood there a moment longer than necessary. Then she took her coffee cup from the counter and walked out to the back porch, pulling the door almost shut behind her, leaving me the particular privacy that people offered to the grieving, present enough to hear a crash, distant enough to pretend they couldn't. I looked at the parcel. Brown paper tied with kitchen twine, the kind Julie had kept in the junk drawer since she was a teenager, and I could never convince her to throw away. My name and address written in blue ballpoint pen, the letters careful and unhurried. Julie had always written that way. She said sloppy handwriting was a form of disrespect to the person reading it. I had taught her that. I had taught her a great many things, and sitting at that kitchen table on a cold October morning in Millhaven, Tennessee, I understood for the first time that she had been paying far closer attention than I ever knew. I untied the twine with fingers that had spent 40 years opening things that were not meant to be opened easily. Inside the brown paper was a tin box, the kind used for cookies at Christmas. And inside the tin, wrapped in a square of blue flannel cloth, I recognized from an old work shirt of mine that Julie had cut up for shop rags when she was 12 years old, was her mother's wristwatch, Eleanor's watch. The one that had been on her wrist the night she died at Millhaven General 12 years ago. The nurses had given it to Julie because Julie had been the one sitting beside her. I had not seen it since the funeral. My chest cracked open like old wood in winter. I held the watch in both hands and felt the weight of it, the small specific gravity of something that had belonged to a person you loved past all reason or explanation. The crystal face was scratched. The leather band was stiff with age. The hands had stopped at 6 o'clock. Morning or evening, I couldn't say. It didn't matter. The watch had stopped, and Eleanor had stopped, and Julie had stopped, and there were mornings when I felt as though everything that had ever mattered had stopped and left me sitting alone at a kitchen table in a house that no longer sounded right. Beneath the watch, folded into a small square, was a piece of paper, Julie's handwriting. 8 lines. Dad, by the time this reaches you, I'll be gone. I need you to stay calm and read this twice before you do anything else. Julian is not who you think he is. He has never been who you think he is. The watch stopped at 6. That's not the time, Dad. That's a number. There's a place on Main Street called Mill Haven Pack and Ship. Private mailbox number 6. The key is taped to the inside of the watch band. Go alone. Tell no one. Not even Clara. Especially not Clara. I love you. You taught me that a good locksmith never forces a lock. You feel for the pins one by one until something gives. That's what I need you to do now. Start with pin number 6. I read it twice the way she asked. The second time my hands had stopped shaking enough that I could feel the inside of the watch band with my thumbnail. The key was there, small flat silver taped with a single strip of clear tape that Julie had pressed on so carefully it had adhered without a single air bubble. I closed my fist around the key. I heard Julian's voice from the living room, unhurried and warm. Clara, have you seen my reading glasses? I think I left them on the side table. I folded the letter along its original creases, placed it in the inside pocket of my flannel shirt, and pressed my hand flat against my chest for a moment, feeling the paper through the fabric. Then I picked up the watch wound, the crown 3 times the way Eleanor always did, and set it face down on the table. I stood up, pushed the chair in quietly, and walked to the kitchen doorway. Julian was standing in the entrance to the living room, one hand resting on the doorframe. Tall, well-dressed, even on a Tuesday morning, his dark hair combed back precisely. He was 38 years old and had the kind of face that made people trust him on sight. Pharmacists generally did. It was an occupational advantage he had cultivated the way other men cultivated charm or money. He saw me and smiled. "Morning, sir," he said. "Sleep all right, you look a little pale." I had spent 40 years as a locksmith in a small Tennessee town. I had opened doors for people in every state of mind, imaginable, frantic, grieving, furious, drunk at 2 in the morning. The work had taught me one thing above all others: you never let a door know you're afraid of what's behind it. "Slept fine," I said. "Just a package from Julie, something she must have mailed before she passed." Julian's smile did not change, but his eyes moved one quick flicker down to my shirt pocket, then back to my face. The movement lasted less than half a second. A person who was not in the habit of watching for exactly that kind of thing would have missed it entirely. I had spent 40 years watching for exactly that kind of thing. "That's hard," Julian said, his voice going soft with practiced sympathy. "Finding her things like that. Would you like some company today? I can move my afternoon calls." "No need," I said. "I think I'll drive into town. Get some air." He nodded slowly. "Of course. Clara's making eggs if you want breakfast first." "I'll eat when I get back," I said. I went upstairs, put on my coat, slid the key into my trouser pocket, and came back down. Clara was standing at the stove, her back to me, stirring something in a pan. The smell of chamomile rose from the mug on the counter beside her. The tea she made me every morning set out before I asked for it, always ready and waiting. I looked at that mug for a long moment. Then I said goodbye and walked out the front door into the cold October air, and I did not look back at the house until I reached my truck at the end of the driveway. When I did look back, Julian was standing at the living room window watching me go. I held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then I got in the truck and started the engine. A good locksmith never forces a lock, Julie had written. All right, sweetheart. Pin number 6. Millhaven Pack and Ship sat between a hardware store and a barber shop on Main Street, the kind of small-town block that had looked exactly the same for 30 years and intended to keep it that way. I had driven past that storefront 1,000 times without ever going inside. It was the sort of place you noticed without seeing a hand-painted sign, a door with a bell above it, 2 metal chairs on the sidewalk that nobody ever sat in. I parked my truck across the street and sat behind the wheel for a moment, watching the door the way I used to watch a lock I had never encountered before. You did not rush an unfamiliar lock. You looked at it first. You tried to understand what it was protecting before you decided how to approach it. The bell above the door jangled when I pushed it open. A young woman behind the counter looked up from her computer. She had reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the unhurried manner of someone who had worked the same counter long enough to have seen most things twice. "Help you," she said. "Private mailbox," I said. "Number 6. I have a key." She looked at me for a moment, then at the key I placed on the counter. She typed something, looked at her screen, and typed something else. Whatever she found there made her set her hands flat on the counter and look up at me with an expression that was carefully neutral but not quite empty. "ID, please," she said. I showed her my Tennessee driver's license. She studied it, nodded once, and came around the counter without another word. She led me to a back room lined floor to ceiling with brushed metal boxes of 3 different sizes. Number 6 was on the second row from the bottom square and unremarkable. She used her master key alongside mine, and the door swung open. "Take all the time you need," she said, and pulled the door to the room almost shut behind her. I stood alone with the open box. Inside was a single item, a cloth-bound journal, dark green, the kind sold at the drugstore on Elm Street for $4.99. Julie had filled 3 of those journals every year since she was 14 years old. I had teased her about it. She had told me that a person who did not write things down was a person who did not trust their own memory, and she did not intend to be that kind of person. I sat down at the small table in the corner of the room and opened the journal. Julie's handwriting, dense and careful, filled every page from margin to margin. She had dated each entry. The first was from 8 months ago. I read with both hands pressed flat on the table to keep them still. She had been systematic in a way that made my throat ache, the same quality of mind she had inherited from me, and turned into something sharper than I had ever managed. She had documented everything: dates, times, locations, the names of facilities that had received shipments from Julian's distribution company, lot numbers stamped on medication packaging that did not match the lot numbers recorded in hospital intake logs. She had cross-referenced pharmacy records against death certificates. She had found the pattern in the numbers the way I found the pattern in a lock, not by forcing it, but by learning its language. The name that stopped my hand on the page was Eleanor Ann Mullen, Millhaven General Hospital, September 14, 2013. Lot number RX4471. Cardiac event, natural causes. The room did not spin. The walls did not close in. I had expected this moment to feel like something structural giving way, like the floor dropping out from under a man's feet. Instead, it felt like the moment after, when the falling has already happened, and you are lying still trying to understand the new shape of the world. My Eleanor. My Eleanor's name in a column with 7 others, all of them dead, all of them assigned the same lot number, like they were entries in a shipping manifest, instead of people who had owned particular laughs, and particular ways of folding laundry, and particular names that people had spoken every day for decades. I turned the pages with hands that felt like they belonged to someone older than me. Toward the back of the journal, Julie had written a section she titled simply Thomas Briggs. Below the name, an address on Sycamore Road 2 miles outside of town. A note beside it in slightly larger letters: he was there. He saw what happened at the warehouse. He is afraid, but he is not gone. He can be reached. Below, Thomas Briggs's name. A single line that Julie had underlined twice: the microSD card is in the lock I asked you to fix. You'll know which one, Dad. You're the only one who could. I closed the journal. I sat in that small back room of Millhaven Pack and Ship for a long time, not moving, not thinking in any organized way, just letting the information settle into me, the way water settled into cracked pavement, finding every gap and filling it cold and permanent. Julie had known she was going to die. She had known, and she had not run, and she had spent her last months building her father a road that led from a stopped watch to a green journal to an address on Sycamore Road. She had trusted me to walk it. She had trusted that a 67-year-old locksmith from Millhaven, Tennessee, was capable of finishing what she had started. I put the journal inside my coat, buttoned it closed, and stood up. The young woman at the counter looked up when I came out of the back room. She took one look at my face and dropped her eyes immediately to her keyboard, the practiced tact of a person who understood that some things a man carried out of a room were not meant to be witnessed. I thanked her and walked out into the October morning. The air hit me like cold water. I stood on the sidewalk outside Millhaven Pack and Ship with my hand on the doorframe and breathed until my chest loosened enough to move without hurting. A pickup truck rolled past on Main Street, the driver lifting 2 fingers off the steering wheel in the Tennessee wave that I had exchanged 10,000 times with 10,000 neighbors, without once stopping to understand what a particular thing it was to live in a place where people acknowledged you without needing a reason. I walked to my truck. I had a journal in my coat and an address in my memory, and a lock at home that my daughter had asked me to fix 3 months before she died. I started the engine and pulled out onto Main Street, and I did not allow myself to feel the full weight of what I was carrying until I was already moving. I could hear Julie's voice echoing in my mind, urging me forward. The lock was open, but the real work was just beginning. I drove home. I came in through this back door and went straight to the kitchen, hung my coat on the hook beside the door the way I had done every day for 30 years, and told Clara I needed to spend some time in the workshop. She was at the sink rinsing lunch dishes, her back to me. "Of course," she said, without turning around. "I'll call you when supper's ready." Her voice was warm and even the voice of a woman who had nothing in the world to hide. I had believed that voice for 14 months. Standing in the kitchen doorway with a dead woman's journal buttoned inside my coat, I understood for the first time what a very specific skill that was to make warmth sound effortless when it was in fact constructed. The workshop was attached to the back of the house by a covered walkway 8 steps from the kitchen door. I had built it myself the year Julie turned 10, when my collection of lock mechanisms and spare parts had outgrown the garage, and Eleanor had told me with great patience 40 years of the trade lived in that workshop, cabinets of pin sets and key blanks and tension wrenches, a lathe I had used maybe twice in 5 years, but could not bring myself to sell the smell of machine oil and cedar that Julie used to say was what she thought of whenever someone asked her what home smelled like. I found the box of old jobs on the 3rd shelf, the one I kept for repairs customers never came back to collect. Padlocks, deadbolts, a few antique skeleton key mechanisms that people brought in because they thought they might be valuable and then forgot about. I went through the box slowly, the way you went through anything that mattered, without hurrying, without assuming you knew what you were looking for until you found it. The padlock was at the bottom. Old brass, the body about 2 inches square, the kind used on garden sheds and storage units for 40 years before everyone switched to combination locks. I turned it over in my hands and felt it, the specific weight of it, the way it sat in my palm. 3 months ago, Julie had brought it to me in a paper bag and set it on my workbench without preamble. "Can you fix this, Dad?" she had said. "It belonged to Mom. I just want it to work again." I had not questioned it. I had taken the lock apart, replaced 2 worn pins, reassembled it, and handed it back to her. She had thanked me with a hug that lasted slightly longer than usual, and I had put it down to grief because we were all still grieving Eleanor in our particular ways, and I had not thought about it again until this moment. I carried the lock to my workbench and switched on the lamp. A standard padlock had a plug, the cylinder that rotated when the correct key was inserted, and around the plug a shell. And inside the shell, the pin stacks that held everything in place. What most people did not know, because most people had no reason to know, was that certain older models had a secondary sleeve fitted between the plug and the shell. A locksmith fitted those sleeves. A locksmith knew how to remove them. I reached for my plug follower, a small cylindrical tool the diameter of a lock plug used to push the plug free without losing the pins, and began to work. It took 11 minutes. When the secondary sleeve came free, something small and flat dropped onto the workbench cloth, with a sound so slight I felt it more than heard it. A microSD card, no larger than a thumbnail, wrapped in a single layer of electrical tape sealed against moisture. I peeled the tape back carefully with my thumbnail and held the card up under the lamp. Julie had pressed a tiny strip of white tape across the face of it. On the tape, in her smallest handwriting, 2 words, "Play first." My eyes burned so badly that I had to set the card down and press the heels of my hands against them until the pressure passed. My shoulders shook once, a single involuntary convulsion, and then I locked it back down the way I had been locking things down for 67 years, by breathing and waiting and reminding myself that there was still work to do. I had just straightened up when I heard the workshop door open behind me. I did not turn around immediately. A locksmith learned early that the most dangerous thing you could do in a tense situation was move too fast. Speed attracted attention. Speed communicated that something was worth protecting. I closed my right hand around the microSD card, brought my hand to my side and pressed the card against my palm with my middle finger. Then I turned around, unhurried, as though I had simply heard a door. Julian stood in the doorway. He was wearing a fleece jacket, and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he was holding 2 mugs of coffee, and he looked for all the world like a considerate son-in-law who had thought to bring his father-in-law something warm on a cold afternoon. The mugs steamed gently in the workshop air. "Clara said you were out here," he said. "Thought you could use this." His eyes moved across the workbench in one smooth, practiced sweep. The open box of old jobs, the lamp, the tools laid out in their places. They stopped for a fraction of a second on the brass padlock, sitting beside the plug follower. Then they came back to my face. "Thank you," I said. I walked to him and took one of the mugs with my left hand, keeping my right hand at my side, fingers closed. The coffee was hot, and I wrapped my left hand around it and let the warmth travel up through my palm. "Working on something?" Julian asked. His voice was easy and pleasant, a man making conversation on a Tuesday afternoon. "Just the old lock from Julie's things," I said. "Wanted to get it working again. Something to do with my hands." Julian looked at the padlock on the workbench. He looked at it for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds, I became aware of my own heartbeat in a way that I generally was not a hard, steady knock behind my sternum that I was suddenly certain he could hear. Then he nodded. "Makes sense," he said. "Keeping busy helps." He raised his own mug. "Let me know if you want company." "I'm all right," I said. "But thank you, Julian." He smiled, turned, and walked back up the covered walkway toward the house. I stood in the workshop doorway and watched until the kitchen door closed behind him. Then I opened my right hand. The microSD card sat in the center of my palm, small and warm and intact, and I stood there looking at it the way a man looked at something that had cost more than he fully understood, yet held carefully with both the weight of what it was and the weight of what it had taken to get here. Julie had known only her father's hands could find it. She had been right. I waited until 11:15. Julian had gone to bed at 10, or appeared to. I heard his footsteps on the ceiling above the kitchen, the particular creak of the third floorboard from the bathroom door that I had been meaning to fix since the previous winter. Clara followed 20 minutes later. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and I listened to the house settle around me, counting the silences between sounds, the way I had counted pin stacks in a lock I was learning methodically, without rushing, making sure I understood the mechanism before I touched anything. At 11:15, I put on my coat and went to the workshop. Julie's old laptop was in the bottom drawer of the parts cabinet, where I had put it the week after her funeral, when Julian had offered to dispose of her electronics, and I had said quietly that I would handle it myself. He had not pushed back. I had not understood why I wanted it until this moment. I plugged in the microSD card using the adapter from my phone kit and waited for the screen to load. One folder, labeled with a single letter A. I opened it. 11 audio files numbered in order, no titles. Each one between 40 seconds and 4 minutes long. I put in the single earbud I used for phone calls, an old wired one, the kind that came free with phones before everyone decided wireless was better, and pressed play on the first file. Julie's voice came out of that laptop like something that had traveled a very long distance to reach me. She was calm. That was the first thing I noticed, and the thing that undid me most completely, not the grief in her voice, but the absence of panic. She spoke the way she had always spoken when something mattered, clearly, at a measured pace, making sure each word landed before she moved to the next. "Dad, if you're hearing this, you found the lock. I knew you would. I need you to listen to all 11 files before you do anything else. Don't stop in the middle. Just listen." I pressed my fist against my mouth and held it there. She had recorded the files over a period of 6 weeks. She explained in the second file the period when she had known what was in her tea and had chosen to stay anyway. Her voice on that file was slightly thinner, the way a voice got when a person was very tired and working hard not to show it. She explained the network clearly and without embellishment. Julian's company, the lot numbers, the substitutions made at the warehouse level, the facilities selected for their vulnerable patient populations, the mechanism by which a pharmacist with access and a willing medical signatory could move contaminated product through a legitimate supply chain without triggering standard inspection protocols. In the fifth file, her voice changed. "Mom didn't die because she was sick, Dad. She died because she was in the wrong ward on the wrong night, and she overheard something she wasn't supposed to hear." A pause. I could hear her breathing. Julian was a pharmacy resident at Millhaven General in 2013. Clara was the charge nurse on the cardiac ward. Mom was admitted for observation. Her heart was irregular, but stable, and Dr. Hale had said she could probably go home in 2 days. Another pause longer. She heard them, in the supply corridor outside her room, and Julian knew she heard them. And 3 hours later, she was gone. The sound that came out of me then was not a word. It started below my sternum and moved upward, and I pressed both hands over my face and bent forward over the workbench, and let it come, a broken, ragged thing that I had been holding back for 12 years, without knowing exactly what I was holding back, or why it had never felt finished. Now I knew why. Because it had not been finished. Because Eleanor had not simply been taken by her failing heart on an ordinary September night. She had been taken deliberately by people who sat at my dinner table and called me sir and brought me coffee in the afternoon. So I gave myself 3 minutes. Then I wiped my face on my sleeve, straightened up, and pressed play on file 6. Julian's voice. It hit me like a hand on the chest, not because it was angry or loud, but because it was neither. He spoke in the flat, administrative tone of a man discussing inventory. He was talking to Clara, and he was telling her that the Millhaven general order for the following month needed to be processed through the secondary supplier, and that the cardiac ward specifically needed to receive substituted product for the beta blocker line, and that Clara needed to make sure the receiving log reflected the original lot numbers and not the replacement ones. Clara said, "What if someone checks?" Julian said, "No one checks. They haven't checked in 12 years. Stop asking me things you already know the answer to." Files 7 through 10 were similar dates. Lot numbers, facility names. Julian's voice cycling through the details of an operation so practiced it had become routine. In File 9, he mentioned a name I did not recognize, a regional inspector, who had begun asking questions about medication, discrepancy reports from 3 facilities in the county. Julian's voice discussing this development was the same voice he used to discuss everything else. He said the situation would be managed. He did not elaborate on what managed meant. He did not need to. File 11 was Julie again. "Dad, the last thing I need you to know is this. Thomas Briggs worked the receiving dock at Julian's warehouse for 4 years. He kept copies of the real manifests, the ones that showed what actually went into those shipments. Julian doesn't know he kept them. Thomas is scared, but he's honest. And honesty is a harder thing to scare out of a person than Julian understands." A breath. "One more thing. Check the back of the radio in the workshop. The old one on the top shelf. I put something inside it for the end. You'll know when it's time." The file ended. I sat in the workshop with the earbud in and the laptop open and the October wind pressing against the single window above the lathe, and I thought about my daughter recording her own voice in this same room, in this same cold, knowing what she knew and doing it anyway. I pulled the earbud out and looked at the top shelf. The radio was there, an old shortwave I had owned since before Julie was born, boxy and obsolete. The kind of thing you kept because getting rid of it felt like admitting something. I had not turned it on in years. I left it where it was. She had said I would know when it was time. I closed the laptop, pocketed the microSD card, and reached up to switch off the workshop lamp. Through the single window across the dark yard, something moved. A figure standing just inside the tree line at the property edge. Still. Watching the lit window of the workshop with the particular stillness of someone who had been standing there long enough to grow comfortable doing it. The lamp went off, and I stood in the sudden dark and looked back through the glass. By the time my eyes adjusted, the figure was gone, but the space where it had stood held its shape in my memory, the way a key held the shape of the lock. It was cut for precisely and without any possibility of confusion. Someone had been watching. I had not slept. I had come back inside from the workshop at 11:30, hung my coat, washed my hands at the kitchen sink, and gone to bed. I had lain in the dark for 4 hours with my eyes open and my hands folded on my chest, and thought about Eleanor standing in a supply corridor in 2013, and about what she must have heard, and about whether she had been frightened in those last hours, or whether she had believed the way people in hospitals tended to believe that the people around her were there to help. At 5:30, I gave up on sleep and went downstairs. Clara was already in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter in her housecoat, her gray hair pinned up loosely, measuring chamomile flowers into the small ceramic strainer she used every morning. The kettle was already heating. She heard me on the stairs and turned with a smile that reached all the way to her eyes, the kind of smile that took years of practice to produce on command, and even longer to make look natural. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep. Old bones," I said. "You know how it is?" She made a sympathetic sound and turned back to the kettle. "The tea will help. Sit down, Arthur. Let me take care of you." I sat down at the kitchen table and watched her work. She moved through this kitchen with the ease of a woman who had made herself at home in it, and she had over 14 months in ways I had noticed and filed away without understanding their significance. The herb drawer reorganized. The coffee mugs moved to the cabinet nearest the window. Small changes individually, meaningless collectively, the work of a person who intended to be permanent. She set the mug in front of me. Steam rose from it in a thin, wavering column, carrying the sweet, familiar smell of chamomile that I had associated until approximately 11 hours ago with nothing more complicated than a warm kitchen and a woman who wanted me to sleep well. "Thank you, Clara," I said. I wrapped both hands around the mug the way I always did. I lifted it toward my mouth. I felt the steam against my face, and I set it back down without drinking the way a man set down a cup that was still too hot naturally, without ceremony, with the unhurried patience of someone who had nowhere to be. In my shirt pocket was a small glass vial, the kind sold at the pharmacy for specimen collection. I had taken it from the first aid kit in the workshop the previous night, before the figure in the tree line had interrupted my thinking. The vial was capped and empty, and approximately the diameter of my index finger, and I had spent 40 years learning to do precise things with my hands, in spaces where other people were watching. Clara turned to the refrigerator. 6 seconds. I transferred a measure of tea from the mug to the vial, capped it, and returned it to my shirt pocket in one continuous motion that looked from behind like a man adjusting his collar. When Clara turned back, I was drinking my coffee. We talked about the weather. She said November was coming early this year, and that she was thinking of putting plastic sheeting on the back windows before the first frost. I said that sounded sensible. She asked if I wanted eggs. I said I wasn't hungry yet. She nodded and refilled her own coffee and sat down across from me, and we sat together in the warm kitchen, like two people who had nothing in the world between them except a quiet Tuesday morning. I excused myself at 8:30, told her I was driving to the hardware store for weather stripping. She said to drive safe. I took the long way out of the driveway, watching my mirrors. Megan Cole lived on Birchwood Lane, 12 minutes from my house on the far side of town. She was 31 years old, the same age Julie would have been next spring, and she had been Julie's closest friend since the first week of college. I had met her at Julie's wedding, and a dozen times after, and I had always thought of her the way you thought of your child's best friends, with a kind of peripheral affection, grateful they existed, without quite knowing what to do with them. It was only now, sitting in her driveway, with the engine running, and a vial of possibly poisoned tea in my shirt pocket, that I understood what Julie had understood. Megan Cole was the person Julie trusted most in the world, who was not me. I knocked. She opened the door in a paint-stained sweatshirt with a coffee mug in her hand, and took one look at my face and stepped back from the door, without a word, pulling it wide. "Mr. Mullen," she said, "come in, please." Her apartment was small and warm and cluttered with the organized chaos of a person who lived fully in their space. Canvases stacked against the living room wall. Books open face down on every flat surface, a cat asleep on the radiator cover, who opened one eye at my arrival and decided I was not worth the effort. I sat at her kitchen table and took the vial from my shirt pocket and set it between us. Megan looked at it. She looked at me. Something moved across her face, not surprise, but the specific expression of a person receiving information they had been halfway expecting and wholly dreading. "Julie told you," I said, "before she died. She told you something might happen." Megan's jaw tightened. Her eyes filled so fast and so completely that the first tear was on her cheek before she had registered it was coming. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth. "She made me promise not to come to you unless you came to me first. She said if she was wrong, she didn't want to put this on you for nothing." Her voice broke on the last word, cracked clean through. "She wasn't wrong, was she?" It was not a question. No, I said. She was not wrong. Megan looked at the vial on the table and straightened her spine with the visible effort of a person pulling themselves back from the edge of something. She wiped her face with her palm. She took a breath that shook on the way in and came out steady. "Where do I take it?" she said. I had written the address on a slip of paper in the workshop the previous night. A private testing laboratory in the next county. The kind that did not bill insurance and did not ask for explanations. 41 hours for a full panel, the website had said. Longer if they needed confirmation on specific compounds. I slid the paper across the table. Megan picked it up, read it, folded it, and put it in the front pocket of her sweatshirt. "I'll go today," she said. "Right now before I lose my nerve." "You won't lose your nerve," I said. "You're Julie's person. She didn't choose people who lost their nerve." Megan made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and pressed her hand flat on the table between us. I put my hand over hers, and we sat like that for a moment, a 67-year-old locksmith and a 31-year-old painter held together by a woman who had trusted us both enough to send us toward each other. I drove home the long way again. Clara was weeding this front garden when I pulled into the driveway, kneeling on the mat she kept by the front step, her gardening gloves, the particular shade of green that Julie had always said made the yard look like something from a catalog. She waved when she saw my truck. I waved back. That night, I lay awake again. At 2:14 in the morning, I heard the floor creak in the hallway, the long, slow creak of someone moving carefully, not wanting to be heard. I lay still and listened as the sound moved past my door down the hall and stopped outside the door to the room that had been Julie's the last time she stayed here. A thin line of light appeared under my bedroom door. Then footsteps, 2 sets, quiet and deliberate. I got up without turning on the light and crossed to the door in my socks and pressed my ear to the wood. Julian's voice very low. "She has to have left something here. He's been in that workshop every day since the package came. Something's in this house, Clara." Clara's voice frightened and thin. "And if he finds it first?" A pause that lasted long enough to make the back of my neck go cold. "Then we move faster," Julian said. "Double the dose starting tomorrow. I want this finished." I stood behind the door with my hand flat against the wood and my heart slamming against my ribs, and I thought about Eleanor in her hospital bed 12 years ago, and about Julie with her careful handwriting and her borrowed time, and about a 67-year-old man standing in the dark in his own house being discussed like a problem to be solved. I went back to bed. I lay down, pulled the quilt up, and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, I thought. Megan would have the results in 41 hours. I could hold a position for 41 hours. I had held harder ones for longer. I closed my eyes and waited for morning. The 41 hours were the longest I had spent inside my own life in 67 years of living it. I drank the chamomile tea every morning the way I always had, both hands around the mug, the steam against my face, and I did not drink a single drop. I tipped it down the sink when Clara left the kitchen, rinsed the mug, and set it back in the dish rack before she returned. I ate the meals she cooked. I answered Julian's questions about the weather and the yard, and whether I had heard anything more from the county about the road resurfacing on Miller Pike. I went to bed at my normal time and lay in the dark counting the hours the way I had once counted the tumblers in a particularly stubborn lock, one by one, without skipping, without allowing myself to think about the end, until I had accounted for every increment between here and there. On the second morning, Julian offered to drive me to the pharmacy. "You mentioned your blood pressure medication was running low," he said, looking up from his newspaper with the attentive concern of a devoted son-in-law. "I'm heading that direction anyway." "I called it in yesterday," I said. "They're delivering." He nodded and went back to his paper. He turned the page at exactly the right speed, not too fast, not too slow. I had spent 40 years reading the language of hands, and Julian's hands were very good at saying nothing. The call from Megan came at 7:43 on Thursday morning while I was standing at the workbench in the workshop, pretending to sort a tray of key blanks. I answered before the second ring. "Mr. Mullen." Her voice was stripped down to its essentials, no greeting, no preamble, just the words she had called to say. The results came back this morning. I drove out there myself to pick them up. A breath. Digoxin, 0.9 nanograms per milliliter. The technician said that in a person not prescribed cardiac medication, that level indicates repeated exposure over a period of days, possibly weeks. I set down the key blank I was holding. Digoxin was a cardiac glycoside derived from the foxglove plant. One of the oldest heart medications in existence, used for 2 centuries to slow and regulate a failing heart. In the correct dose administered to the correct patient, it kept people alive. In the wrong dose accumulated over time in a person with a healthy heart, it caused the organ to stutter and seize in ways that looked on any standard examination, not specifically testing for it, exactly like natural cardiac failure. A 67-year-old man, with no documented heart condition, dying suddenly of what appeared to be cardiac arrest, a doctor familiar with his case would sign the certificate without hesitation, especially if that doctor had already established in the medical record a pattern of irregularity, especially if that doctor was the one who had written the death certificate. "Mr. Mullen," Megan said. "Are you still there?" "I'm here," I said. "Thank you, Megan. You did good." "What do we do now?" "You go home," I said. "You lock your door. I'll call you tonight." I ended the call and stood at the workbench for a moment, with both hands flat on the surface, looking at the tray of key blanks arranged by size from smallest to largest, the way I had arranged them for 40 years. A locksmith kept his materials in order. You could not find the right key in a moment of need if you had not kept things in order during the quiet times. I put on my coat and walked out to the truck. Main Street was quiet at 8 in the morning. A few pickups angled in front of the diner, the hardware store just opening its doors. Mrs. Patterson from the post office walking her terrier, the way she did every weekday between 7:45 and 8:15. I drove past the diner and turned onto Courthouse Square and pulled into the small lot beside the pharmacy. I was halfway across the parking lot when I heard the engine. A dark sedan was parked at the far end of the lot, engine running, positioned with its nose toward the exit, in the way that cars were positioned when their drivers intended to be somewhere else quickly if necessary. The driver's window came down as I walked. Julian. He was not in his pharmacy coat. He was in a dark jacket, one arm resting on the doorframe, and he was watching me cross the parking lot with an expression of such practiced pleasantness that a person seeing it for the first time would have felt genuinely warmed by it. "Sir," he said, "didn't realize you were heading out. I thought the pharmacy was delivering." I stopped walking. The distance between us was approximately 20 feet, enough that I could not be touched, close enough that I could see his eyes clearly. They were doing what eyes did when the face around them was performing a different emotion. They were still. Too still. Measuring. "Felt like getting out," I said. "Stretch my legs." "Of course." He smiled. "Small town, though. Hard to do much without running into someone." He let that sit for exactly 1 beat. "You feeling all right? You look a little pale this morning." A 67-year-old man whose tea was being laced with a cardiac toxin standing in a parking lot, with the man who had ordered it done being asked if he felt all right. I looked at Julian Marsh, and I thought about Eleanor in a supply corridor at 2 in the morning. I thought about Julie's voice on a recording, calm as still water, telling me things she had known would cost her everything to say. I thought about a microSD card in a brass padlock at the bottom of a box of unclaimed repairs, and about the particular patience required to feel for a pin without disturbing the ones beside it. "I feel fine," I said. "Thank you for asking, Julian." He held my gaze for 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds, something passed between us that had no name in ordinary conversation, the specific acknowledgement of 2 people who understood that they were no longer pretending to each other, even while they continued to perform the pretense. Then he raised the window. I stood in the parking lot and watched the sedan pull out onto Courthouse Square and disappear around the corner at a speed that was just slightly too deliberate to be casual. I stood there until the sound of his engine faded completely. A locksmith's second rule, I thought, was one I had learned not from any training, but from 40 years of practice. Once you had identified the mechanism, you did not touch it until you were ready to open it completely. A half-opened lock was more dangerous than a locked one. It told the lock that you were there. Julian knew I was there, which meant I had to move faster than I had planned. I took out my phone and found the address I had written in the back of Julie's journal the night before. Thomas Briggs, Sycamore Road, 2 miles outside of town. I got in the truck and drove. I drove to the hardware store on the way home from Sycamore Road. The camera was on the 3rd shelf of the electrical aisle, a small wireless unit barely larger than a matchbox, with night vision capability and a motion sensor that pushed footage to a paired phone the moment anything in its field of view moved. I had installed similar devices for clients over the years, mostly in garages and storage spaces, always for straightforward reasons. A man who kept forgetting to lock up. A woman who suspected her contractor was leaving early. The kind of quiet domestic suspicion that small towns generated in abundance, and that a locksmith was occasionally called upon to resolve. I paid cash, $43.16. The room I chose was the one Julie had used on her last 3 visits, the guest room at the end of the upstairs hallway across from the linen closet. Julian had been through it already, I was certain of that, but certainty about the past did not prevent a return visit. The room had 2 outlets. The one beside the small writing desk in the corner gave a sight line that covered the full width of the space, including both the closet door and the window. I fitted the camera into the outlet plate in 18 minutes, tested the angle from my phone in the workshop, adjusted it twice, and locked the room. I put the key in my wallet next to Julie's. Clara called me for supper at 6. We ate pot roast and green beans and a bread she had made from a recipe she said had belonged to her mother. And Julian talked about a supply contract he was negotiating with a hospital network in Knoxville. And I listened and asked 2 questions, and complimented the bread, and thought about the camera at the end of the hall, pointing at a door that nobody knew was being watched. I went to bed at 9:30. At 2:17 in the morning, my phone vibrated against my palm. I had been lying with it in my hand for hours, screen dimmed to nothing, waiting. The notification was a single short pulse motion detected, and on the screen, the guest room door swung inward in the green-tinted monochrome of night vision. Julian came in first. He moved the way people moved when they did not want to be heard, low and quick, his weight distributed carefully, each step placed rather than taken. He had wrapped something dark around his shoes. He pulled the door almost shut behind him, stood still for a moment, with his head slightly tilted, listening. Then he produced a small flashlight, narrow-beamed, precise, and went to work on the bookshelves along the far wall. He pulled books off in groups of 3 and 4, fanning the pages, running his thumb along the spine of each one before replacing it. His movements had the fluid efficiency of someone who had searched rooms before and had learned to do it without leaving obvious traces. He worked the shelves from left to right, top to bottom, replacing each book in approximate order. Not perfect order. He did not know the original arrangement well enough for perfect order. but close enough that a person who had not been paying attention would not notice. Clara came in 4 minutes after him. She moved differently, less certain, her eyes wider, her hands reaching for things, and then pulling back before touching them. She checked the closet, running her hands along the shelf above the hanging rod, pressing the back wall for hollow spaces. She got on her knees and looked under the bed with Julian's flashlight. She stood back up with the slow, effortful movement of a woman whose knees had been giving her trouble for years and whose fear was making everything harder than it needed to be. Julian did not look at her while she worked. He had moved to the writing desk by then, pulling each drawer completely free, checking the underside, replacing it. He unscrewed the back panel of the desk with a tool he had brought in his jacket pocket. Found nothing. Replaced the panel. His hands moved without hesitation, without frustration, with the administrative patience of a man working through a checklist. Clara whispered something I could not hear. Julian turned to look at her. Even in night vision, even at the distance the camera imposed, his expression was clear enough. It was not the face of a man reassuring a frightened partner. It was the face of a man assessing a tool that was beginning to malfunction. "You checked the baseboard registers," he said. His voice was barely above a breath, but the camera's microphone was good. "I checked them," Clara said. "Check them again." Clara got back on her knees. Her shoulders were shaking. She checked each baseboard heating register along the far wall, shining the light into each one. And when she reached the last one and found it empty, she sat back on her heels and pressed her hands against her face. A sound came out of her that was muffled by her palms, but still audible, not crying, exactly more the sound a person made when they had been holding something very tightly for a very long time, and their grip had finally slipped. Julian crossed the room in 4 steps. He did not put his arm around her. He did not say anything reassuring. He stopped in front of her, reached down, and took hold of her arm just above the elbow and pulled her upright in one sharp motion. Clara stumbled, getting her feet under her. Then he slapped her. Not a theatrical gesture. Not the kind of blow that movies depicted, open-handed and dramatic. A single, flat, efficient strike across the left side of her face that snapped her head to the right and left her standing with one hand pressed to her cheek and her eyes wide and completely, absolutely still. Julian's voice when he spoke was the same voice he used at the dinner table. "Pull yourself together," he said. "We try again tomorrow." He turned off the flashlight. They left the room. The door pulled almost shut behind them. The camera showed the empty room in green monochrome, the displaced books, the slightly crooked desk drawers, the indentations in the carpet where Clara had knelt. I lay in the dark for a long time after that. I had known in the way that you knew things from evidence and logic, and the accumulated weight of facts arranged in order that Julian Marsh was a man who hurt people. I had known it from Eleanor's name on a lot number manifest, and from Julie's voice on a recording, and from a test result that showed 0.9 nanograms of a cardiac toxin in a cup of tea. I had known it the way a locksmith knew the inside of a mechanism he had never seen but could read from the outside. Seeing it was different. Seeing was the pin dropping into place. I pressed my thumb against the phone screen and saved the footage to 2 separate locations, the cloud backup Julie had set up on the old laptop and a USB drive I kept in the workshop. Then I set the phone face down on the nightstand and put my hands flat on my chest and stared at the ceiling. Clara had been with Julian for 12 years. 12 years of being used and managed and struck without warning in the rooms of other people's houses while the man she believed loved her moved through the dark with a flashlight and a checklist, and the absolute indifference of someone who had never once thought of her as anything other than a means to an end. The ceiling did not offer anything useful. Ceilings rarely did. I thought about what Julie had written in her journal about Thomas Briggs, that he was afraid but honest, and that honesty was a harder thing to scare out of a person than Julian understood. I thought Julian might be wrong about more than Thomas Briggs. Megan was waiting on her front porch when I pulled up at 7:15, a travel mug in each hand, and her keys already out. She had not asked questions on the phone the previous evening when I called and told her we needed to drive to Sycamore Road in the morning. She had said what time, and I had said 7, and she had said she would be ready. That was the thing about Julie's people. They had learned from Julie that some situations did not improve with additional conversation. She handed me one of the travel mugs when I got out of the truck. It was black coffee, no sugar, which she could not have known I took, but had guessed correctly. I thought about what that said, about how well Julie had known me, and did not let myself follow that thought any further than its first step. Thomas Briggs lived at the end of Sycamore Road, in a white clapboard house that needed painting, and knew it. The front yard held a bird bath, a rusted metal rooster, and a Ford pickup that had not moved in long enough for leaves to collect along the base of the tires. I knocked twice. The man who opened the door was 52 years old and looked older. He was broad across the shoulders with the permanent stoop of someone who had spent decades lifting things at the wrong angle, and his face when he saw me went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: recognition, relief, and a terror so raw and unguarded that it hurt to look at directly. "Mr. Mullen," he said. His voice came out thick like a man who had been awake all night rehearsing a conversation he had been postponing for years. "I figured you'd come eventually. Julie said you would." He stepped back and let us in. His kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and pipe tobacco, and the table had not been cleared since the previous day's mail. He moved 2 catalogs and a stack of circulars and gestured for us to sit, and then he sat down across from us and put both hands flat on the table and looked at them the way a person looked at something they were about to pick up that they knew was going to be heavy. "I worked Julian's receiving dock for 4 years, he said without preamble. 2015 to 2019. I knew what we were doing by the end of the first month. You didn't have to be a pharmacist to read a manifest. You just had to be able to read." He described the operation the way a man described a recurring nightmare, in the flat, precise language of someone who had gone over it so many times that the horror had worn smooth at the edges but had not diminished underneath. The authentic medications arriving from licensed manufacturers pulled from the outgoing shipments before they ever left the dock, sold through channels that Thomas described as best not to know about in detail. The substitutes going out in their place repackaged, relabeled, the lot numbers reassigned by hand, with a thermal printer Julian kept locked in his private office. "The facilities he chose," Thomas said and stopped. He pressed his lips together and tried again. "They were chosen specific, not random. He had a list. Places with high turnover elderly patient staff that was overworked and undersupervised. Places where a patient getting worse looked like a patient getting worse." He looked up at me. "Your wife was not on the original list, Mr. Mullen. She was a complication. Different category." The coffee in my travel mug had gone cold. I became aware of this without doing anything about it. "He kept records," Thomas said. "Real ones, I mean. Not the official books. A second set on a drive he kept in the false bottom of the filing cabinet in his office. I saw it once by accident, when the cabinet tipped during a delivery. I never told him I saw it." He exhaled slowly. "I kept copies of the real manifests. 4 years of them. Upstairs in a fireproof box under the floorboards in my bedroom, because I couldn't make myself destroy them. And I couldn't make myself go to the police because I had signed those manifests and my name was on them. And I was 48 years old, with no savings, and Julian had made it very clear what happened to people who created problems for him." He looked at Megan, then back at me. "Julie came 8 months ago," he said. "She sat right where you're sitting. She didn't ask me to do anything. She just showed me what she had and asked me what I remembered. His chin dropped toward his chest. His shoulders began to move with the slow, grinding rhythm of a man crying, without making any sound, the kind of crying that had gone past the stage of sound a long time ago. She was so young. She was so careful and so brave, and I sat here and I told her almost nothing because I was afraid, and now she's gone and I have to live with that. Megan put her hand on the table between them, but did not reach across. She understood somehow that Thomas needed the distance. "She left us enough," I said. "What you have upstairs will finish it." Thomas nodded and pushed back his chair. He was gone for 3 minutes. When he came back down, he was carrying a fireproof document box, gray and battered with a combination lock on the hasp that he opened with the automatic ease of a number he had entered 10,000 times. He set it on the table and lifted the lid. 47 manila folders, each one labeled by date in Thomas's careful block printing. I looked at 4 years of evidence arranged in chronological order by a frightened man who had kept faith with it in the only way he knew how, by not destroying it, and not running, and not convincing himself it wasn't what it was. "There's a storage unit behind my brother's property," Thomas said. "Half a mile up the road. I keep some equipment out there. If you want to look at the manifests together, there's a table and a light." We followed his truck in mine. The storage unit was a corrugated metal building, set back from a gravel lane padlocked with a chain, the kind of structure that existed in the margins of small Tennessee properties, without anyone paying them much attention. Thomas unlocked the chain and pulled the door open. The smell hit me before anything else. Not immediately identifiable, not the sharp, obvious bite of an active leak. Something underlying faintly sweet beneath the cold air, the particular olfactory signature of a gas that had been accumulating in an enclosed space for long enough to reach a concentration that should concern anyone who recognized what they were smelling. I grabbed Thomas by the shoulder and pulled him back from the doorway. "Don't go in," I said. "Don't touch the light switch." Megan had been reaching for the interior wall. She froze. Natural gas was odorless in its pure form, the mercaptan added to it, for exactly this kind of situation, a smell. Utility companies had chosen specifically because the human nose registered it as wrong, even before the conscious mind processed why. The concentration inside the storage unit was not immediately dangerous in the open air, but one spark, a light switch, a phone screen, metal scraping concrete would change that assessment permanently and without warning. I told Megan to take Thomas to the far end of the gravel lane and keep moving away from the building. Then I went to the side of the structure where the gauss line entered from the ground, crouched down, and used the adjustable wrench I kept in my coat pocket. A habit of 40 years, carrying a tool you needed less often than you expected, until the day you needed it badly, to close the exterior shut-off valve completely. I stood up and breathed the cold morning air, and thought about Julian Marsh, knowing we were coming. He had not been trying to kill us quickly. A gas explosion in a storage unit on a rural property outside town, that was the kind of event that got ruled accidental without significant inquiry. A maintenance issue. A faulty connection. An old building and bad luck and 3 people in the wrong place. I walked to where Megan and Thomas were standing at the end of the lane. Thomas was gray in the face. Megan had her hand on his arm. "He knew," Thomas said. It was barely above a whisper. "Yes," I said. "Then it's not safe. None of this is safe anymore." "No," I said. "It isn't." I looked at the box of manifests under Thomas's arm. "Which is why we're not waiting any longer." We were back on Sycamore Road, Megan's hand on the door handle of my truck, when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. A photograph. Sarah, my brother. Eddie's daughter, 19 years old, standing outside the iron gate of Millhaven Community College with her backpack on one shoulder and her head slightly bowed against the wind, the way she always walked when she was thinking about something else entirely. She was wearing the red wool coat she had gotten for her birthday in September. I had been there when she opened it. I had watched her put it on in her parents' living room and do a small self-conscious spin and ask if it was too much. The photograph had been taken from above, and at a distance the particular angle and compression of a telephoto lens, or a small aerial device, the kind that could be operated remotely from a position of complete invisibility. Sarah had not known anyone was watching. There was nothing in her posture that suggested awareness. She was just a 19-year-old girl walking out of school on an ordinary morning, completely unaware that someone had turned her into a message. Below the photograph, one line of text: "You have 2 hours. Bring the card to the storage room behind the pharmacy on Elm. Come alone. Or Sarah has the same kind of accident as Julie." My vision narrowed to the center of the screen. Megan had seen my face change. She came around the front of the truck without being asked, and I turned the phone so she could read it, and she read it twice, and the color left her face in the deliberate, organized way that color left the faces of people who were controlling a serious reaction. "Sarah," she said. "Yes," I said. I was already dialing. Sarah answered on the second ring. Her voice bright and slightly distracted, the voice of a young woman between classes who was not expecting anything to be wrong. "Uncle Arthur, hey." "Sarah." I kept my voice the way I kept my hands on difficult jobs, steady, deliberate, giving nothing away through pressure. "I need you to listen to me carefully and not ask questions until I'm finished. Can you do that?" A pause. When she spoke again, the brightness was gone. "Yes. Go to the bursar's office and tell them you have a family emergency. Get your car. Drive to your parents' house in Franklin. Pay for gas with cash from your wallet, not your card. Don't post anything. Don't text anyone except your mother to say you're coming, and don't tell her why until I call your father tonight. Do you understand everything I just said?" "Uncle Arthur, you're Sarah." Another pause. Shorter. "I understand." "Good girl," I said. "Go right now. Don't stop." I ended the call and stood on Sycamore Road in the cold November air with the phone in my hand and thought about a 67-year-old man who had run out of hours to be careful in. Megan said, "What do we do?" "You take Thomas and the manifests and you go to your apartment," I said. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except me." I looked at the box of folders under Thomas's arm. "Copy everything you can. Drive, flash drive, whatever you have. Make 3 copies and keep them in different places." Thomas nodded, his face still gray from the storage unit. He had not said much since we left the gravel lane, but his arms had not loosened their grip on the manifest box once. I drove to Millhaven General. Dr. Robert Hale had an office on the 2nd floor of the medical building attached to the main hospital, a corner room with his name on a brass plate beside the door, and 2 potted ferns inside it that had been dying slowly for what appeared to be several months. He was sitting behind his desk when I pushed the door open, and he looked up with the automatic professional pleasantness of a man accustomed to managing whatever walked through his door. And then he saw my face and the pleasantness went away. He was 55, trim, with the careful grooming of a man who understood that appearance was a professional asset. His hands, when I sat down across from him without being invited, went flat on the desk in the way that hands went flat when their owner was bracing for something. I took Julie's photograph from my inside pocket and placed it between us. It was the one from her last birthday, the cookout at Eddie's house. Julie, in a yellow dress, laughing at something off to the left of the frame, with her whole face the way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her into happiness. I had carried it since the funeral in the same pocket where I kept my hand tools because it seemed right to keep her close to the work. Dr. Hale looked at the photograph. His face came apart. Not gradually, not with warning all at once, the professional composure dissolving like something that had only ever been a surface application over what was underneath. His jaw dropped toward his chest. His eyes filled so completely that the first tear reached the desk before he had registered it was falling. He pressed both hands over his face, and his shoulders shook with the force of something that had been sealed in for a very long time under considerable pressure. "I signed it," he said from behind his hands. His voice was barely recognizable as the same voice that had said good morning 60 seconds ago. "I signed her death certificate. Julian told me she had a documented cardiac history, that it was consistent, that there was no need for a medical examiner referral. He showed me records. He had records, Mr. Mullen, with my own consultation notes on them that I never wrote." He dropped his hands. His face was destroyed. "He fabricated my handwriting. He put a cardiac irregularity consultation in her file dated 8 months before she died in my name, and I never saw a patient named Julie Marsh in my life until I was signing her out of it. I had known this. I had known it from Julie's journal and from the files on the microSD and from the particular way that Julian operated, anticipating the documentation he would need and creating it in advance the way a careful man prepared his tools before the job rather than after. Knowing it and hearing it said out loud by the man whose name had been used were two different things. "He also holds a debt," I said. "A gambling debt. Yours." Hale closed his eyes. He did not deny it. He sat with his eyes closed for 4 seconds, and when he opened them, they were wet but steady, the eyes of a man who had just stopped pretending something to himself that he had been pretending for a long time. $41,000, he said. "Over 2 years. I was in a bad place. My wife had left. I was making poor decisions." He looked at Julie's photograph. "Julian came to me 6 months after I first borrowed money from him. He was very calm. He said the debt could be managed. He said all he needed was my cooperation on certain administrative matters." His voice dropped until I could barely hear it. "I told myself it was paperwork. I told myself no one was getting hurt. Someone got hurt," I said. "I know." His voice cracked clean through on the second word. "God help me, I know." I leaned forward and placed both hands flat on the desk. "I need you to write down everything you just told me," I said. "Every detail, dated and signed, and I need you to be willing to repeat it in a formal proceeding." Hale looked at me for a long moment, at an old man in a flannel shirt, sitting across from him in a dying fern office, asking him to do the most frightening thing he had ever been asked to do. "What happens to me?" he said. "I don't know," I said. "That's an honest answer, but I know what happens if you don't." He looked at Julie's photograph one more time. Then he reached into his desk drawer, took out a legal pad, uncapped a pen, and began to write. I had known he would run. Not because Robert Hale was a coward. I had stopped believing that during the 40 minutes I sat across from him, while he wrote, watching his hand move across the legal pad, with the slow, effortful determination of a man dragging something heavy uphill. Cowards did not write like that. But fear and courage were not opposites. A man could be both at once, and the fear could win on any given night, especially a night when Julian Marsh knew your name and your debt and the precise location of everything you had left to lose. I had driven home, eaten the supper Clara left warming in the oven, and gone upstairs at 8:30. At 9, I came back down, told Clara I had forgotten something in the workshop, and went instead to my truck. I drove to the Millhaven bus station on Commerce Street and parked across the street and cut the engine and sat. The station was a small building, brick and fluorescent, open until 1 in the morning on weekdays. 2 buses made stops in Millhaven, one north to Nashville, one south to Chattanooga. The Nashville bus departed at 12:30. I had looked it up on the way. At 11:45, my phone buzzed. Hale's message was 4 words. "I can't do this." I typed back, "I know. Look across the street." Look. 30 seconds passed. Then the glass door of the bus station opened, and Robert Hale stepped out onto the sidewalk with a canvas overnight bag on his shoulder, and his collar turned up against the cold. And he stood there in the fluorescent spillover from the station entrance and looked at my truck across Commerce Street with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the exit he had planned was already occupied. I got out and walked across. We sat on the wooden bench along the outside wall of the station, under the overhang out of the wind. Hale had the overnight bag between his feet and his hands in his coat pockets, and he was staring at the middle distance with the fixed, unseeing look of someone whose mind was moving very fast through a very small number of options. "How did you know?" he said. "I've been reading Locke for 40 years, I said. "A man who has just decided to do a brave thing and then goes home to an empty house and a phone that might ring at any moment, that man doesn't sleep. And a man who doesn't sleep starts making calculations. And the calculation almost always comes out the same way the first time." I looked at him. "The second time is harder to predict." Hale laughed a short, airless sound that had nothing to do with humor. He pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead and held it there. "Julian called me at 10 o'clock, he said. "He didn't mention the statement. He didn't mention you. He just called to remind me that the note on my gambling debt came due in 3 weeks, and that he had always found it preferable to resolve financial matters privately rather than through formal channels." Hale dropped his hand. "He knows. He doesn't know what I wrote, but he knows something shifted today." "What did you tell him?" "That I appreciated the reminder and would be in touch." He exhaled slowly. "Then I packed a bag." The Nashville bus was visible now at the far end of Commerce Street, its headlights moving through the dark toward the station with the unhurried certainty of something that ran on a schedule, regardless of what was happening in the lives of the people waiting for it. I looked at it, then at Hale. "I'm going to tell you something about my daughter," I said. "Not about the case, not about what she found or what she documented or what it's going to mean in a courtroom, just about her." Hale turned to look at me. "She was 31 years old, I said. "She liked to bake bread on Sunday mornings, and she always made too much of it. And she left the extra on the neighbors' porches without knocking because she said the leaving was the point, not the credit. She drove 40 minutes each way to visit me every other weekend, even after she married and moved across town because she said driving was thinking time and she had a lot to think about." My throat tightened. I breathed through it. She found out what Julian was doing, and she did not run. She stayed, and she documented, and she built something that she knew she might not live to see used. She trusted that the people she left it for would carry it the rest of the way. I stopped. The bus had pulled into the station, its air brakes released with a long, exhausted sigh. The door folded open, and the driver stepped down and stretched his back and looked at the empty sidewalk with the mild professional patience of a man who had stopped at this particular station enough times to know that Millhaven rarely produced much traffic at midnight. Hale was looking at his overnight bag. "She came to see me 8 months ago," he said. "I told her almost nothing. I said I didn't know what she was talking about." His jaw tightened until the muscle in his cheek jumped. "She thanked me for my time. She shook my hand. She walked out of my office and I watched her go, and I told myself I had made the right decision." He picked up the overnight bag and held it in both hands and then set it back down between his feet. "I have thought about that handshake every single day since the morning they told me she was gone." The bus driver had gone back inside the station. We sat in the cold under the overhang, and neither of us spoke for a while, and the not speaking was not emptiness. It was the specific weight of two people sitting with the same absence feeling its shape from different sides. "The statement you wrote today," I said finally. "Where is it?" "Inside jacket pocket," Hale said. "I didn't leave it at home. I didn't trust—" He stopped. "I didn't trust myself not to destroy it if I went back for it." "Give it to me," I said. He reached inside his coat and took out a folded sheaf of papers. 6 pages dense with his careful physician's handwriting, the pages slightly crumpled at the corners from being held too tightly. He held it out, and I took it and put it inside my own coat against my chest, where I had carried Julie's letter on the first morning. Hale looked at the bus. "The 12:30 Pausiswed. Nashville." "I know," I said. He looked at me. He looked at his bag. He looked at Commerce Street empty and cold, a small Tennessee town at midnight, with the bus running on schedule, and a man trying to decide what kind of person he was going to be for the rest of his life. Then he picked up the overnight bag and stood up. And he walked back inside the bus station, not to the ticket window, to the row of plastic chairs along the far wall where he sat down, set the bag at his feet, and looked at his hands in his lap with the careful, emptied expression of a man who had just put something down that he had been carrying for a very long time. I sat on the bench outside for another few minutes. The Nashville bus loaded 3 passengers and pulled out at 12:32, running 2 minutes behind schedule. I watched its taillights diminish down Commerce Street until they were gone. Then I got up, crossed the street, and drove home through the dark Tennessee night, the statement folded against my chest, and the bus station lights shrinking in my rearview mirror, growing smaller and smaller, until the road curved and they disappeared entirely. Dale Cooper had been the sheriff of Millhaven for 19 years, and before that he had been a deputy for 11. And before that, he had grown up 3 streets over from me on Walnut Avenue and stolen apples from the Hendersons' tree every September until old Mr. Henderson caught us both and made us rake his yard for 2 weekends running as restitution. We had been friends since before either of us understood what friendship was, which meant we had been friends long enough to know when the other one was carrying something he had not yet put into words. He was behind his desk when I came in reading a report through his bifocals with the concentrated patience of a man who had learned to read everything twice because the first pass never told you enough. He looked up when I closed the door, took his glasses off, and set them on the desk. He looked at my face for 3 seconds. "Sit down, Arthur," he said. I sat. I had brought everything. The microSD card, the audio files loaded onto a small recorder I had bought at the electronics store on my way across town, Thomas's manifest folders in a paper grocery bag. Hale's 6-page statement. The lab results Megan had printed and brought to my workshop the previous afternoon. The camera footage of Julian and Clara transferred to a USB drive. I laid each item on Dale Cooper's desk, one at a time, in the order I had assembled them, and I explained each one in the same plain, sequential language I used when I walked a client through what had gone wrong with their lock and what I had done to fix it. Cooper listened, the way he had always listened, without interrupting, without reacting visibly, with the quality of attention that made you feel each word was being placed somewhere it would not be forgotten. He had been still for so long by the time I finished that the coffee in his mug had gone cold without him touching it. When I stopped talking, he stood up. He walked to the window behind his desk and stood there with his hands in his back pockets, looking out at the courthouse square below the hardware store, the diner, the barbershop with the striped pole that had been turning since 1974. He stood there for a while without speaking, and I let him because some things needed a moment between being heard and being responded to. "I remember Eleanor's funeral," he said to the window. "You stood at the front of the church, and you thanked people for coming one by one for 2 hours. You shook every hand. I watched you do it, and I thought, I don't know how he's still standing." He paused. Now I know you've had practice standing when you shouldn't be able to." He turned around. His face had done what faces did when they had processed something large. It had gone very still, the way water went still after something heavy had been dropped into it, and the rings had moved all the way out to the edges, and there was nowhere left for them to go. "The neighbor," he said. "Danny. The one on your left side who moved in 8 months ago." "I know he's watching," I said. "I don't know who he is." Cooper went to his filing cabinet and pulled a folder. He opened it on the desk between us and turned it to face me. A Tennessee driver's license photocopied. A rental agreement. A background check with 3 addresses in 2 states over the past 4 years. Daniel Marsh, 33 years old. Listed occupation freelance contractor. "Daniel Marsh," I said. "Julian's younger brother," Cooper said. "Different mother, same father. Half-brother, technically. Moved into the rental on your left side 8 months ago, 2 weeks after Clara moved into your house. I ran him last week when you mentioned someone had been watching your property. His record is clean, which tells me he's careful, not that he's innocent." Cooper tapped the folder. "He's been reporting your movements to Julian. Every time you left the house, every time you had a visitor. That's how Julian knew you were going to Thomas. The gas in the storage unit. The sedan in the parking lot. The photograph of Sarah taken from above. Julian had not been reacting to what I did. He had been watching me do it in real time through his brother's eyes and adjusting accordingly. The storage unit had been prepared before we arrived because Danny had called ahead. The sedan had been waiting in the parking lot because Danny had seen me leave the house. The flycam photograph of Sarah had been Julian's answer to my visit to the bank, a message delivered within hours because he had the infrastructure to deliver it. "I want to arrest him," Cooper said. "Danny, today, before he makes another call." "Not yet," I said. "If Danny disappears, Julian knows the circle is closing. I need 2 more days." Cooper looked at me steadily. "What happens in 2 days?" "I set a table," I said, "and you bring the guests." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car horn sounded once on Courthouse Square and faded. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. "This goes up," Cooper said. "State-level minimum. Pharmaceutical fraud, homicide by substitution, falsification of medical records, attempted murder with the gas. That's federal territory on at least 3 counts. I have to make calls tonight, Arthur. This can't stay in my office." "Make your calls," I said. "I'm not asking you to keep it local. I'm asking you to time it right." Cooper picked up Hale's statement and read the first page. He read slowly, the way he read everything. Halfway down the page, his jaw tightened until the muscle jumped under his ear, and he finished the page and set it face down on the desk without reading the rest. "He forged consultation notes," Cooper said, "in a licensed physician's records, to cover a homicide." "Yes." "And Eleanor?" "Yes." Cooper put both hands flat on the desk and looked at them. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 30 years in law enforcement, large scarred across the knuckles from a bar fight in 2003, that he did not like to talk about, steady as anything I had ever seen. "I'll make the calls tonight," he said. "State Bureau and 1 contact at the DEA field office in Nashville. The manifests Thomas kept, that's their angle in." He looked up. 2 days. 2 days, I said. He stood and extended his hand across the desk. I stood and shook it. The grip of a man who had shaken my hand at Eleanor's funeral and shared 100 ordinary Tuesdays in between, and who understood without needing it, said that this handshake was different from all of those. "Arthur," he said, as I picked up the grocery bag. "Danny Marsh, I'm putting a car on your street tonight. Plain clothes, plain vehicle. You won't see it." "I know I won't," I said. That's why I trust you to do it." I walked out through the sheriff's department, past the dispatch desk and the holding area and the bulletin board, with the community notices pinned to it in overlapping layers, and out through the glass front door into the November morning. 2 days. I had held harder positions for longer, but not many. Before I reveal the shocking tape that brought down their entire empire, comment the word "lock" right now, so I know you are still here with me in the dark. And a quick warning. The following events contain intense creative dramatizations that may not be entirely factual. If you prefer not to listen to this kind of climax, you are welcome to turn off the video right here. I drove home the long way. Not because I thought I was being followed. Cooper's plainclothes car was already on my street. I trusted that, but because I needed the time between leaving the sheriff's office and walking back through my own front door. There was a version of me that existed inside that house, a version I had been maintaining for weeks now, with considerable effort, and I needed to locate him again before I needed him. The man who thanked Clara for supper. The man who asked Julian polite questions about his work. The man who went to bed at a reasonable hour and did not appear to be building a case that would end with federal agents in the living room. I found him somewhere on the county road between Courthouse Square and Miller Pike. The way you found a tool you had set down temporarily. It had not gone anywhere. It was exactly where you left it. You just had to remember where that was. Clara had made chicken and dumplings. The smell hit me when I came through the kitchen door, butter and thyme, and the particular richness of a long-simmered broth that filled the whole ground floor of the house and made it feel for a moment that cost me something to feel like a home. Clara was ladling bowls at the counter. Julian was already at the table with his phone scrolling through something with the half-attention of a man who was thinking about something else. He looked up when I came in. "There he is," he said pleasantly. "We were about to send a search party." "Hardware store was backed up," I said. "You know how Saturdays are." He nodded and looked back at his phone. I hung up my coat, washed my hands at the sink, and sat down across from him and accepted the bowl Clara set in front of me and said it smelled wonderful, and it did, and I ate it. We talked about the weather turning. Clara said she had heard there might be a hard frost by Wednesday and asked if I had brought in the tomato cages from the back garden yet. I said I had not and thanked her for the reminder. Julian said he had a delivery meeting in Knoxville on Monday, that he was not looking forward to long drive for a short conversation, and I asked what the contract was for and listened to the answer with the attentive interest of a man who had nothing more pressing on his mind than chicken and dumplings and the first frost of the season. After supper, Julian went to his office. Clara washed the dishes. I dried them and put them away, and said good night, and went upstairs. I lay on my bed in the dark for an hour. Then I got up, put on my coat and boots, and went to the workshop. The night was clear and very cold, the kind of Tennessee November night that smelled like wood smoke from 3 directions, and made the stars look closer than they had any business being. I could see my breath in the beam of the small flashlight I carried, small white clouds disappearing into the dark above me as I crossed the yard. Inside the workshop, I did not turn on the overhead light. I used the flashlight, keeping the beam low, pointed at the floor. I had thought about this and decided it was the right choice. The overhead light was visible from the house, from Danny Marsh's rental next door from the street. The flashlight, kept below the window line, was not. The radio was on the top shelf where it had always been. I lifted it down with both hands and carried it to the workbench and set it under the dark. It was heavier than I remembered, or perhaps I was remembering it wrong, remembering it as a young man's weight rather than an old one's. The difference between 45 pounds and 67 being more than just years. It was a realistic DX15OB shortwave, purchased in 1979 at the Radio Shack on Summer Avenue in Memphis. The summer I opened my first shop. I had carried it from that shop to this workshop across 4 decades and 3 addresses, and it had sat on one shelf or another, the entire time turned on occasionally to prove to myself it still worked, mostly left alone. Julie had listened to it as a child. She had been fascinated by shortwave, by the idea that voices from other countries were traveling through the air around you all the time, and you just needed the right receiver to hear them. She had asked me once, when she was maybe 9 years old, whether the voices were still there even when the radio was off. I had told her yes. The signal didn't stop just because you stopped listening. File 11 had told me to check the radio when I was ready to move, not before. Tonight, with Cooper's call confirmed and the dinner invitation accepted, I was ready. I opened the back panel the way Julie had described. Inside, nestled in the cavity behind the speaker housing, where the original transformer had been, was a small object wrapped in the same blue flannel that had wrapped Eleanor's watch. I unwrapped it carefully. A thumb drive. Standard size, black casing, a strip of white tape on the face with 2 words in Julie's handwriting, for the end. I held it in my palm and looked at it for a long time in the thin beam of the flashlight. She had said I would know when it was time. Tomorrow night, I would invite Julian and Clara to dinner. Tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, whatever was on this drive would play in my living room with Julian and Clara, and whatever remained of the life they had built on top of the graves of people I loved. And then Dale Cooper would come through the front door with people behind him, and it would be finished. That was tomorrow. Tonight, I had one more thing to do. I set the thumb drive on the workbench and sat down on my stool and looked at the radio in the dark workshop, and I talked to my daughter. Not out loud, not in any way that could be heard or recorded or explained to another person. In the way that a father talked to a child he had lost in the language of shared memory and private history and all the things that had existed between exactly 2 people and now existed in only one, held in trust against the day they could be set down somewhere safe. I told her about Thomas and his fireproof box. I told her about Megan standing on her porch with 2 coffees at 7:15 in the morning, already ready. I told her about Dale Cooper standing at his office window with his hands in his back pockets, needing a moment between hearing and responding, because some things were too large to rush. I told her about Robert Hale sitting in the bus station on a plastic chair at midnight, setting something down that he had carried too long. I told her I had found everything she left me, every pin in the right sequence, in the right order, opening one lock after another, the way she had planned it, with patience, without force, the way she had learned it from me and turned it into something better than I had ever managed. You did good, Julie, I told her. You built it perfectly, and I found every piece. Tomorrow night it ends. I sat with her until the workshop cold worked its way through my flannel shirt and settled into my shoulders. Then I wrapped the thumb drive back in its blue flannel cloth and put it in my breast pocket against my chest, where I kept things that needed to stay close to me. I put the radio back on the shelf. Outside, the Tennessee night was as quiet as it ever got, which was not entirely quiet, because it never was, because there was always a dog 2 streets over, and a truck on the highway, and the wind moving through the last of the season's leaves. But quiet enough. I turned off the flashlight and stood in the dark workshop for a moment. Then I crossed the yard and went back inside and climbed the stairs and got into bed and closed my eyes. And this time, for the first time in longer than I could accurately remember, I slept. I woke at 5:30 on Monday morning and lay still for a few minutes listening to the house. Clara's breathing steady and deep from the far side of the bed. The furnace cycling on in the basement, the familiar knock and hiss of old ductwork. The wind picking up outside, the first suggestion of the front coming down from the northwest. All of it ordinary. None of it what it appeared to be. I got up without waking her, dressed in the dark, and went downstairs. Julian came down at 7:15 in a collared shirt, poured coffee, asked if I had slept well. I said I had. He looked out the kitchen window with the comfortable ease of a man who believed he was in control of everything he could see from it. I watched him look out that window and thought about Eleanor in a hospital corridor 12 years ago. Julian, I said. He turned. I'd like to have a proper family dinner tomorrow evening. The three of us. 7 o'clock. He smiled with the warmth of a man who had no idea the table was already set against him. That's a wonderful idea, sir. It'll be good for all of us. I called Megan from the workshop at 8. She had been awake since before 6. Everything, I said. Thomas's manifests, the lab results, the camera footage, Dr. Hale's statement. Registered mail to the State Bureau contact Cooper gave you. Physical copies and a digital drive. Not email. There's a FedEx on Commerce Street that opens at 8:30, she said. I'm already putting my coat on. After you send it, go to your sister's in Brentwood, I told her. She said she would. She said to call her the second it was done. Cooper came by at 2 under cover of a noise complaint. Took 5 minutes at my kitchen table while Clara looked for paperwork. DEA confirmed. Teams in position by 6:30 tomorrow. Danny Marsh picked up at 6:45. 7 o'clock, everything moved at once. In the workshop that evening, I prepared the radio. Not the shortwave that one had already given me what Julie put inside it. The other one. An old tabletop from the 1960s that had belonged to Eleanor's mother, boxy and brown, sitting in the corner of my workshop for 30 years. Its speaker carried better than the shortwave in a closed room, and Julie had known that too. She had written it in the margin of file 11, use the RCA, not the DX. Better projection. I connected the amplifier, loaded the thumb drive, tested 4 seconds of playback. Julian's voice filled the workshop. I stopped it. Sat with my hands flat on the bench. Thought about tomorrow. The radio sat under the lamp, old and brown and completely unremarkable, a thing that had been here so long it had become invisible. That was the thing about the right tool. It didn't look like what it was until the moment you needed it to. I set the table myself. Eleanor's good white plates. Cloth napkins folded on the diagonal the way she had taught me. 2 white candles in the brass holders that had been on this table since before Julie was born. I went to the workshop and came back with the radio, the old RCA, tabletop heavier than it looked, and set it on the kitchen counter, where it looked exactly like what it appeared to be. An old man's keepsake. Nothing more. The amplifier was tucked behind it. The thumb drive was already loaded. 1 tap on my phone would start the playback. Julian came downstairs at 6:50 in a sport coat, looked at the table, and something moved across his face that I would not have caught if I had not been watching for it. Not pleasure. Satisfaction. The expression of a man watching an arrangement proceed according to his expectations. We ate. He talked about Knoxville, complimented the rosemary in the pot roast, refilled his water glass without being asked. Clara did not look at me once during the meal. Halfway through, Julian set his fork down. The property on Junction Road, he said. Julie's land. I think it's time we talked about the estate. I looked at him across the candlelight and thought about 60 acres donated to the Millhaven Community Fund 1 month before my daughter died, recorded and irrevocable permanently beyond his reach. I thought about Julie, knowing she would never see his face when he found out. She had not been afraid. She had been a locksmith's daughter. That's funny you should bring that up, I said. I reached under my chair and set the radio on the table between the pot roast and the candles. Julian's eyes went to it immediately. Recalibration. Clara's fork stopped. She recorded everything, Julian, I said. I pressed play. Julian's voice came out of that old radio like something that had been waiting a long time to be said in the right room. The recording was 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Julie had captured it through the heating vent above the stove 6 months before she died, while Julian was on the phone in the hallway below. His voice was unhurried and precise, the same voice he used at dinner, in the parking lot, everywhere. which was what made it so particular to hear discussing the disposal of a human life. The voice said, "The old man is going to be a problem. That needs to stop." Clara's hands went flat on the table. The voice said, "You're not his wife because you love him. You're there because I need someone in that house." Clara's chin came up. Her jaw tightened. The voice said, "You think I keep you around because I have feelings for you. You're useful, Clara. That's different. When this is over, I walk away clean." Clara made a sound, one short exhalation, that carried 12 years of believing she was something other than what she was. When the recording ended, the room was very quiet. Julian looked at me, then at Clara. Clara was not looking at the radio anymore. She reached into her cardigan pocket and placed an envelope on the table. White sealed her name on the front in her own handwriting. 3 weeks ago, she said, her voice steady where the shaking was happening somewhere deeper. "After the night you hit me," she pushed it toward me without looking away from Julian. "Everything I know, notarized." Julian's hand shot across the table. Clara pulled it back before he reached it. "Don't," she said. One word. 12 years compressed into one syllable. Then she looked at me. "You should have known better than to underestimate a locksmith's daughter." Blue and red light swept through the front curtains. I stayed in my chair and breathed. The front door opened without anyone inside having to touch it. Cooper had a key, a duplicate I had cut myself. The previous afternoon slipped across the kitchen table while Clara was upstairs. He came through first in uniform with 2 DEA agents behind him, in dark jackets with yellow letters across the back. The back door opened 4 seconds later. 2 more agents, same jackets, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this enough times to have developed a personal style for it. I stayed in my chair. Julian had not moved since he saw the lights. He stood at the end of the table with his hands at his sides, and what remained when the performance finally left his face was simply a man cold and precise and entirely without remorse, standing in a small Tennessee dining room, understanding that 12 years had arrived at their last step. Cooper looked at me first. "Arthur, you all right?" "I'm all right," I said. He read Julian his rights without inflection, the way a man read something he had read 1,000 times, and understood the weight of each time regardless. Julian said, "I want my lawyer." Cooper said, "Hands behind your back." Julian complied, not surrender, just calculation. The handcuffs closed with a sound like a lock. Clara stood beside my chair when they led Julian out. At the hallway door, she stopped and looked back at me. I held her gaze, not absolution, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. One person to another. Then she went. Cooper sat across from me a final moment. "Your daughter did good work, Arthur." My throat closed. I looked at the candles until it opened again. "She did," I said. After he left, I snuffed the candles one by one between my thumb and finger and sat in the dark while the last federal vehicle pulled away and breathed, and it was enough. They were gone by 9:30. I washed Eleanor's plates by hand, dried them, and put them back in the cabinet where she had always kept them. I covered the pot roast and put it in the refrigerator. I folded the cloth napkins and set them on the counter and blew out the last candle I had missed, the one behind the trivet that had burned itself down to a stub without my noticing. Then I sat at the kitchen table with Julie's journal and a cup of coffee and read it from the beginning, not for information. I had the information. I read it because it was her voice, and her voice was what I had, and I was not ready yet to put it down and go upstairs to a house that was just a house again. I read for an hour. Near midnight, I turned the last page I had read before and found beneath it a page I had missed in the first pass, because it had been folded in half and pressed flat against the back cover, invisible, unless you were holding the journal in both hands with the light at a particular angle. Julie's handwriting. 3 lines. Dad, when it's over, check the back of my wedding photo. The one on your mantel. Use the lamp. The warm bulb, not the overhead. You taught me the ink needs heat, not brightness. I love you. You were always enough. I set the journal down. I sat with those 3 lines for a long time, in the quiet kitchen in the house that was just a house again, while the November wind moved through the elm tree outside, and the clock above the stove ticked the way it had ticked for 30 years, and would tick for 30 more. Then I got up and went to the mantel. The photograph had been on the mantel since the wedding. Julie in white, Julian beside her, both of them looking at the camera, with the particular stillness of people who have just been told to hold still and are doing their best. I had looked at it 100 times in 14 months, and seen my daughter's face and been grateful for it, and not looked too long because looking too long hurt, in ways I had not yet learned to manage. I lifted it down with both hands. I turned it over. The back was blank. I carried it to the lamp on the side table, the old one with the amber shade that had belonged to Eleanor's mother, the bulb, a 60-watt incandescent, that I had replaced with the same kind every time it burned out, because Eleanor had liked the color of the light, and I had seen no reason to change it. I held the back of the photograph close to the bulb. For a moment, nothing. Then, slowly, the way a photograph developed in a dark room. The way light pulled something out of darkness that had been waiting there all along, the ink began to appear. Julie's handwriting. Small and careful, the letters close together, the way she wrote when she had a lot to say, and not much space to say it in. Dad, by the time you find this, you already know most of it. But there's one thing I need you to know that isn't in the journal or the recordings. Julian married me for the land. The property on Junction Road, the 60 acres that have been in our family since Grandpa bought them in 1961. It sits on the corridor for the new highway the county approved last spring. Julian found out 18 months ago. That's when the timeline changed. That's when he stopped being patient and started being urgent. I donated it. 1 month before I died, I signed the deed transfer to the Millhaven Community Fund. It's recorded at the county clerk's office. Permanent. Irrevocable. The land belongs to the town now, and there is nothing Julian Marsh or anyone connected to him can ever do about that. He spent 12 years building towards something that was already gone. I need you to know that, Dad. Not because it changes what he did, but because I need you to understand that he never had us. Not really. He had access to us for a while. That's different. You taught me that. A locksmith's job isn't to keep people out forever. It's to make sure that when someone tries the door, they find it already locked from the inside. I locked it, Dad. You just had to come and check. I love you. I have always loved you. Go to bed. Julie. I stood at the lamp for a long time. The ink held its shape in the warm light, each letter precise and unhurried, written by a woman who had known she would not see this moment, and had written toward it anyway, with the same patience and the same care she had brought to everything she had ever done that mattered. I set the photograph face up on the side table. Julie looked at the camera. The particular stillness of a person holding still. I sat down in the chair beside the lamp. Eleanor's chair, the one with the worn armrest on the right side where she had rested her hand for 30 years, and I held the photograph in both hands, and I let everything come that needed to come without managing it, or measuring it, or deciding in advance how much of it I could afford. I gave myself as long as it took. When I was done, I set the photograph on the side table face up where I could see her, and I sat in Eleanor's chair in the quiet house. And I thought about a 67-year-old locksmith from Millhaven, Tennessee, and about his wife and his daughter, and about the specific, irreplaceable shape of a life built with people who loved you well. The clock on the mantel read 1:47. I wound it. I set the hands. I went to bed. People ask me what I learned from all of this. I learned that silence is not the same as peace. I stayed quiet for 12 years, while grief made me stop asking questions, and that quietness cost me more than I can calculate. These are family stories that don't stay in the past. They follow you forward into every room you sit, in every cup of tea someone hands you with a smile. Don't do what I did. Don't let loss make you stop looking at the people closest to you. I learned that the ones who underestimate you are counting on your agreement. Julian looked at a 67-year-old locksmith and saw a simple, grieving old man. He was wrong about Julie. He was wrong about me. In the end, the family drama revenge he set in motion came back to him through the very people he had used and discarded. I believe, and I say this, as a man who has seen the worst that people can do to each other, that God puts the right tools in the right hands at the right moment. Julie left me a road. I just had to be willing to walk it. These are the kinds of family stories revenge cannot erase because the truth has a way of finding the door even when someone has tried very hard to lock it from the outside. If this story reached you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, there is a button right there that costs you nothing and means everything to a channel like this. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted with the intention of teaching something true. If that is not what you are looking for, no hard feelings. Choose what feeds your soul and come back when you are ready.